Everybody. I'd like to introduce Jonas Jägermeyr from Columbia and NASA Goddard, right?
Yes, Goddard Institute for Space Studies.
Yes, that's the one, has a full name. Yeah, who's been doing a lot of stuff on modeling the world's crops across many different kinds of modeling systems, and yeah, he'll give us insight into how climate change is going to affect crop growth and agriculture. Yeah, so welcome.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Greg. I'm looking at the list of previous presenters, so it's kind of an honor to join that list. I'm very, very excited. I don't really know who's going to watch this, so I try to keep it broad and high level. At the same time, this is a modeling seminar, so I do want to dive in and share some insights of what our work is in trying to understand climate change impacts in global agriculture. And that's a pretty broad title, so we will have to narrow it down a little bit. But we are working across scales. We're trying to establish high-level global megatrends where we headed, but also then zoom in and really understand field-level implications that are relevant for the farmer. And the video we just watched is a simulation done with the DSAT model, one of the well-known, well-established crop models, for Iowa at a very, very high spatial resolution. So the models can do simulations across resolutions, but it really comes down to what input data we're feeding into the model. So starting high level, I would like to introduce AgMIP. It's a mouthful, so bear with me. It's the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project. It's an initiative of about 1,200 scientists at this point, focused on understanding climate impacts in agriculture, leveraging models. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to harmonize and professionalize the climate impact science. So a lot of people talk about what climate change is, how the atmosphere is changing, how the weather models are running, how temperature and precipitation are changing, but we're trying to translate that information into what it means for society. So the climate impact science, and we're way behind the climate sciences in terms of funding support, in terms of protocol development, formalizing and professionalizing the impacts, the studies. So that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. At the same time, what we do in AgMIP, with all these different initiatives here in the flower diagram, I lead the top right corner, the global crop model intercomparison, AgGrid and GGCMI global community that runs their model for large-scale impacts. But that then it feeds into yet another MIP called the ISIMIP, Inter-Sectoral Model Intercomparison Project, in which I coordinate the agricultural sector. And the emphasis is on inter-sectoral. So we're tying agriculture in with a bunch of other sectors, including water, human health, biomes, all sorts of things that are affected by climate. We want to study that in a harmonized way across sectors, all using the same database, using the same inputs and so forth, so we can compare these studies. So that's where we're coming from. In IGIST, an ugly slide, but this is highlighting what I mean when I use the term crop model. We're referring to a process-based or gridded crop growth simulation model, such as DSAT mentioned earlier, or APSIM, EPIC, LPJML. There are a bunch around that different teams run in different locations for different crops, for different regions, and so forth. And those are pretty hardcore models that have been developed over decades. It's not an empirical thing that you just run on your laptop. Those run on supercomputers and contain all the biophysical knowledge that we have established over decades. But the principle is the same for all of those models. We're taking climate data, temperature, precipitation, radiation and CO2 and sometimes more, and feed that into the model. And then we're using management information and other important information to characterize the agro-ecosystem. So that would be planting dates, varieties or cultivar information, what type of plant is grown, when and how much fertilizer is applied, if there is irrigation and when the crop is irrigated, what crop is actually grown, where and what time during the year, and then very importantly, what kind of soil information or type of soil are we simulating in this specific environment. We put a lot of emphasis on model evaluation and improvement. This is a community that's still evolving. So there's a lot of model development happening. But then we have a bunch of stakeholders or the reasons, outputs that why we're doing this. And the number one aspect is often an impact assessment. We want to understand how a production system works in a different environmental context. That can then turn into an adaptation or a mitigation study, developing pathways towards that, or attributing specific climatic events or climate conditions. But a second very important avenue of why we're doing this is the use of our data in economic trade or price models. So we're simulating how crop growth and yield or productivity is changing. But the question is, how would that then change demand, trade, and price of agricultural commodities? And then increasingly important is the development towards early warning systems and seasonal forecasts. And I have a slide on that later on. I keep this brief, but I do want to highlight a couple of historical benchmark simulations that we did to provide context for the following. In 2014, Cynthia Rosenzweig established the first multi-model ensemble simulation in this community, taking global crop models, ask individual people to run the model following a harmonized protocol. So that was the kickoff for this whole body of work. And what we learned is that the uncertainties coming from these individual crop models are so much larger than the uncertainties from the climate models driving them that we basically concluded, well, it looks like we have to go back and do some homework first before such an ensemble impact assessment is ready for prime time. In what we call phase one, GGCMI, the global gridded crop model intercomparison, we did exactly that. We looked back in time using a bunch of existing reanalysis products to simulate historical periods. And the benefit is we can go compare it with observations and try to make sense of these spaghetti plots and learn and improve the capacity of those models. In the follow-on phase, we took the body of models and ran them in systematic perturbation experiments, which means along all these different axes, including temperature, precipitation, CO2, we perturb the inputs systematically to create a hyper-response surface, basically a lookup table that you can go in and say, how is maize productivity changing if my environmental conditions change X, Y, Z? This is a very high compute activity, but it's very handy to run fast statistical emulators that can give you a decision or an output right away without the need to run these crop models. And then leading up to a more recent multi-model ensemble work, now taking actual climate change scenarios into account, is work that I focus here a little bit on, but the slide is outdated, so we have a lot more work coming or passing the timeline here, but I think it's important for context. So I spoke of the emulator's statistical representation in, let's see if this works. This is an interactive map that shows the results from these hyper response cubes, and allows you to go in and change, say, the temperature, turn it up a little bit. What happens if we turn on the precipitation a little bit? We have a CO2 slider too. What if there's higher CO2 concentration in the future? And we can immediately evaluate impacts in our region of interest. So this is a very handy tool for researchers and stakeholders alike. Before diving more into the topic of global warming, another part of climate change is global cooling, dimming. And we did work on nuclear conflict a couple of years ago based on a scenario that seemed likely at the time, a conflict between India and Pakistan. What happens if there's a regional nuclear escalation contained by those to those countries, and what will be the indirect global effects on food security? This is what two different climate models simulated: a decline in global average, global mean air temperature of 1.8 degrees Celsius, averaged over 5 years. And that's a pretty significant number, comparable in magnitude to, say, the Paris Agreement when we talk about global warming, something that would disturb crop growth significantly. And we see this characteristic sharp decline after the conflict and a gradual recovery over 10 to 15 years back to normal. In comparison, the crop response, global maize productivity, follows that distinct pattern with a sharp decline, gradual recovery, averaged 13% yield anomaly for 5 years. And that is a substantial number. That's a larger anomaly than recorded in history, and would certainly disturb the food system substantially. What's interesting from a modeling perspective here is that there's a little window between the yellow and the gray cluster of simulations. That means the uncertainty across the crop models, the different dash types, is smaller than the uncertainty between the climate models, the two different colors. And we'll come back to that in context of climate change. So in a cooling scenario, the uncertainty is fairly manageable. It's fairly clear how that would affect crop growth. When it comes to warming, things become a little bit more complex. Those global numbers obviously have regional pattern. The first thing we notice is a strong latitudinal geographic gradient with the largest declines in higher latitudes, which makes sense. If a temperature-limited production system in, say, Canada, Northern Europe, and Russia is affected by further cooling, that will affect crop growth much more than systems in the tropics that are already very warm, which is highlighted by those regional aggregations, fairly flat responses in tropical systems, and much larger declines in the global north. Ironically, those countries with the largest nuclear stockpile actually face the largest declines in domestic food production. 41% of maize is to the global production stems from the United States. So the exposure is large, and the effect on domestic production is large too. A final observation here that's interesting from larger global perspective on climate change impacts is cooling is actually more harmful for global crop productivity than warming. Now, the figure here on the left isn't particularly striking or scientific. Those are two different studies pasted alongside. But we can eyeball that a decline of 3 degrees Celsius global average is indicated to cause more than 40% decline in maize productivity, whereas a 3 degree warming, on the other hand, would only lead to a roughly 13% decline in crop productivity. So why is that? Number one reason is that the main bread baskets that produce the bulk of global production are located at fairly high latitudes in developed countries. So cooling would affect those more than warming does. CO2 fertilization buffers some of the adverse effects from warming. And then on top of that is that climate change is a gradual change, which gives us time to adapt and potentially mitigate, whereas a nuclear conflict is basically a shock to the system that comes overnight, and there is not much you can do to adapt your production system, at least in the first year. Okay, that was a little excursus on how we use those modeling frameworks in different ways. Now let's talk a little bit about climate change. This is a animation of actually the largest ensemble of process-based crop models evaluating climate change impacts under different climate scenarios for different crops worldwide, based on the latest CMIP 6 climate projections. And as we're going through the century, these impacts emerge, the changes become more clear, and we see dramatic differences between crops, wheat and maize, but also between regions. And we need to understand why that is and if it's realistic. One thing that is not directly apparent from those maps is that there again is a very strong regional north-south gradient. Largest declines are happening in lower latitudes, whereas higher latitudes usually see less negative impacts and potentially even gains, which is a problem for livelihoods in the region, as often developed countries are at higher latitudes and have a higher capacity to adapt. Diving into some specific numbers. This figure shows the average end-of-century global maize productivity impacts under two climate scenarios. A high mitigation scenario in green, so a world where we do a lot of effort to reduce climate change, and a high emission scenario, basically the worst case scenario, where all of our efforts to contain climate change fail. The difference is substantial, -6 and -14% respectively, global productivity change. What I want to point out with this slide is the uncertainty bars going around the median change. And the dashed line depicts the range of different climate model impacts, and the solid line is the range of crop model outcomes. And for the low emission scenario, the length of these bars are fairly equal. So the uncertainty coming from both model sources is comparable. However, as we move to a high emission scenario, the range of crop model uncertainty, or the range of crop model outputs, thus uncertainty, inflates substantially, much more than the climate model uncertainty does. So the crop model uncertainty dominates the picture from positive changes all the way down to more than 50% declines.
Question.
Another thing I want to point out here is the comparison.
So you point to the uncertainty across different models, different types. What about uncertainty due to different realizations of the climate, or uncertainty due to different like the way people respond to climate change?
Right. That's a great question, and I should have pointed that out more. The entire study here and the work I'm presenting is based on the assumption that we're not changing any management. We're not adapting the system. We're trying to isolate the climate signal deliberately. And then we can talk about adaptation later. At this point, we're just trying to understand what happened, what would happen to a system if the climate would change this way without the farmer changing, which is unrealistic because, people would adapt.
And then variability across different climate realizations, because even, the climate forecast is a cone of probability. So how big is that uncertainty compared to these?
Yeah, that's sampled by those two climate scenarios, a low emission, high emission scenario. There's a couple ones in between, but this is basically the envelope of what people think is a realistic future.
Right.
And then we sample, this is the greenhouse gas concentration pathway. And then we sample what that could mean with different climate models. We have 5 different climate models here depicted by the letter. And then we sample the range of impacts to maize productivity with 12 different crop models. Right. And then highlighting real quick those two highlighted circles, I mentioned the Cynthia Rosenzweig study, the first of its kind in 2014 that kicked off this whole global community. That study, based on CMIP 5, concluded under the worst climate change scenario thinkable with a positive response, plus 1% end of century high emission scenario. The same scenario setup, worst case climate change, maize productivity, now with updated climate models and updated crop models, leads to minus 24% productivity change. That is a substantial shift within a couple of years of model development and research, which is dramatic. And we have to acknowledge that the field is evolving, and we have to understand where we're headed, because this is not something that's stable. For wheat, on the other hand, we're anticipating global level increases in productivity, largely fueled by higher latitude growing regions that can benefit from moderate warming, but also strong CO2 effects that help boost yields for wheat, but not for maize, as maize can't use higher CO2 for concentrations in the same way a wheat plant can. The model range uncertainty is comparable. All right. I also would like to establish the concept of time of emergence. That's a useful concept used in many disciplines, but not so much in the climate impacts community. It basically relates historical variability to the mean signal leaving that envelope, and that's what we call point of emergence. It's a nice way to look at deviation from a risk perspective, because a very variable system is accustomed to change, whereas a very stable system would be hit harder by a sudden deviation. So the time of emergence is expected at global level, within the next decade or so, for if climate change continues the path it has recently. If we're going through the century, by the end of the century, under a high emission scenario, about 3/4 of all maize cultivated land would see that kind of climate impact emergence. So 74% of global cropland area would go through substantial changes in crop growth. For wheat, on the other hand, we're looking at positive time of emergence, basically happening as we speak, but many models also indicate a peak and decline scenario. So first, yield boost associated with CO2 and moderate warming, but then warming exceeds the range of beneficial conditions and then decline towards the end of the century. We can map the time of climate emergence, impact emergence, and what stands out here is that those regions that don't see a climate impact emergence under a high emission scenario on the right-hand side still show similar time of emergence estimates. So early in the century, basically in the next decade, compared to the high emission scenario. Conclusion is that those regions that are expected to see those impacts under climate change will do so soon, regardless of the climate change scenario you're studying. Here I want to go fast, but you can ask the questions, okay, why have these models changed, or why have these results changed so much? And in summary, there are 3 points to make. The CMIP 6 ensemble is warmer, significantly warmer than CMIP 5, especially over land. So that leads to a stronger effect on crop growth. The models have changed, and the ensemble consists of different crop models now. We can dive into that and fill a whole seminar on that, but the warming sensitivity is more realistic in the new generation of models. And then CMIP 6 comes with a much higher CO2 concentration. But in fact, the model response has come down a little bit. So one of the problems is that the models are extremely sensitive to CO2. So in the latest iteration of models, sensitivity came down a little, potentially making it more realistic. All right, I want to pause here and close with these higher level observations and shift gears a little bit to, okay, what's next? What are fair enough, but what is missing? What do we need to do next? Number one thing is we need to expand the number of crops we're studying. And that's what we did in a follow-on study that also comes with a nice visualization that's live online. It's an interactive explorer where we can go through a long list of crops. Some of them you may have never heard or seen, specifically relevant in sub-Saharan Africa. You can go through the list, look at their nutritional profile and how it changes under climate change. So I think that's particularly relevant to look at understudied crops, opportunity crops or orphan crops, to go beyond maize, wheat, rice, and soybean. The next point is that we need to go deeper than just looking at 30-year average changes, because a mean condition can hide substantial interannual variation. And that's in case what the models indicate, even though we see significant average maize declines and wheat increases, the interannual variability here measured as CV, coefficient of variation, is changing, is increasing for both crops and in many important crop growing regions, even in regions where wheat is seen to show yield increases. So that means that variability can actually destabilize a system, and that's something we need to study in particular, especially with an eye on extreme events that are likely studied in our crop models. The models are not sensitive enough to extreme events, such as heat waves. This is just a quick example of another project where we looked historically to attribute heat waves, and we were able to show that in a world without humans, the counterfactual simulations, we would still have heat waves, but they're less severe than in the actual observations. Next point is that
a question
climate
about
change
variability. So you're focusing, heat waves is one, but what are the other ones? And to what extent are we talking about spatial variability, like one country has a good yield, another one bad yield, and temporal, where you have,
Yeah.
like a month when something bad happens?
Yeah, I'm mostly talking about temporal variability here,
Mm-hmm.
and because a production system doesn't really move, right? A farmer or country is locked in. So that's particularly relevant how your fluctuations between years play out. Spatial variability is historically has eased out global production quite dramatically. So the largest fluctuations in global maize and wheat production is only a couple of percent, 3 or 4%. And that is because if there's a crop failure in one region, it is usually buffered by an average or above average production in another world region. So global production is surprisingly stable. However, there is indication that climate change can lead to a higher likelihood of multiple breadbasket failures at the same time. So we are running into potential scenarios where, the U.S., Europe, and China are hit by mega drought at the same time,
Right.
and that would be an unprecedented situation that we need to be aware of. But here I'm mostly talking about temporal variation.
Okay, and this is interannual. And to what extent is intra-annual, like, delayed rains or something like that? Is that a threat?
Yeah, no, a harvest usually happens once a year.
Mm-hmm.
In those higher latitude breadbaskets. So here I'm comparing yields across years, measuring the coefficient of variation across a time series of 30 years.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Okay. So crop quality is something I want to flash real quick. Again, this is something we can fill a whole seminar with. But climate change affects productivity, but at the same time, it affects the nutritional content. In this case, we're simulating protein content as a proxy for micronutrients, such as zinc and iron and vitamins, fundamental to human health and our diet. But higher CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere help the plants grow faster and bigger, but at the same time, they're diluting the nutritional content. This is a complex situation. We see that top row shows CO2 responses, a declining correlation, but then on the other hand, temperature increases lead to an increase in protein content. So the complex interplay between precipitation changes, temperature, and CO2 changes need to be studied carefully to conclude how protein or micronutrient changes play out under different environmental conditions. You already asked about adaptation. I want to keep this light as there's a lot more work coming on adaptation. We're currently running a big simulation round with multiple models addressing farm level adaptation specifically. But of course, we have to mention that everything I have said so far is based on the assumption that the farmer doesn't change anything in the field. But obviously, there's a lot you can change. You can change your planting dates, use a different cultivar, install irrigation, things like that. However, initial studies that we have done indicates that the adaptation benefit in lighter blue shades is higher in higher latitudes, whereas in tropical, subtropical regions in the global south, our adaptation capacity is usually much lower, which leaves us with the same disproportionate picture that we saw in the beginning, that impacts are going to be much more severe in lower latitudes than in higher latitudes. Now I want to finish up with a few slides on more recent work. This is a study that was published recently by Andrew Hultgren. And this has received a lot of attention in the media as well as in the scientific community. And it's based on an econometric approach and concludes with climate impacts as well as adaptation trained on historical data. Now, this is a fantastic scope of work. However, the results are fundamentally pessimistic, and we're very surprised that such an approach using a single model is published at highest level in Nature, confusing a lot of the scientists who've been working on this topic for decades. And here, for example, is the results that's based on the latest multimodal ensemble archive I've been talking about, here as shown in the IPCC AR6 Working Group 2 report. And you immediately notice significant changes, especially for wheat, which need to be addressed. We're currently drafting a response to this paper, pointing out some of these methodological challenges. And it's a difficult position to be in because we don't want to argue that climate change is less impactful or severe than the study may make it look like. At the same time, this topic is so complex and so nuanced that we really need to be careful what to put out and how to steer and advise stakeholders. And such fundamental differences in the results is not helping. In this context, here's the reasoning of our response to those econometric models, or in general, why empirical models tend to fail for long-term climate change impact assessments under high emission scenarios. You're training your model on historical observations, and then you're exposing them to vastly different environmental conditions, including CO2 concentrations that are doubled, temperature that are way out of your sample size, as a sample group, and those kind of things. Real quick, this is a typical empirical relationship.
Jonas, one question.
Yeah.
Can you summarize kind of how they approach it? Because it's very different from how you do it. So just that contrast is pretty useful.
This is basically the example. This is what I'm walking through here right now on this slide. So we're using a empirical temperature response function that shows slight increases in yield and then a dramatic decline above, say, 30 degrees Celsius. That's observed in historical data. That's what the econometric approaches are based on. And that's also what we can simulate using a similar empirical model. However, if we trained the empirical model on a sample, yield sample, that is exposed to future climates, so a +2, +4, and +6 degrees Celsius environment, the regression slopes substantially decline. So you have less severe impacts for a specific day that is, say, a 35-degree heat day, has significantly less impact in a world that is has experienced a significant amount of warming compared to the historical reference period. Meaning, empirical models solely trained on historical periods struggle to accurately foresee future impacts in crop growth based on environmental conditions. So think of it, a 35-degree heat day in current conditions in the place where I am is usually associated with very hot day, drought day, and very impactful to crop growth. In the future, that day may actually occur much more often, and therefore is less of an impact because it's not necessarily a drought day, and the moisture and temperature interactions have changed. We put this to the test with a so-called perfect model experiment, we trained that same empirical model that was used in the study and trained it on historical simulations of the process-based crop models, and then asked them to predict the future simulations of the process-based crop models. And sure enough, they fail and show significantly more pessimistic predictions compared to the process-based crop model projections. However, a reasonably a model that is reasonably how do you say it? Fidelity, has the fidelity to reproduce test database, is expected to simulate the outputs of any sample that was targeted to do so. So I was struggling to explain this a little bit, but this is a very powerful way to show that there are non-linear dynamics that really need to be factored in those long-term projections under high emissions, and that's the reason why process-based crop models are developed and need to be used to study those conditions. Okay.
So to what extent can it be, because the econometric approach, the nice thing about it is that you actually see people responding to the warm days, but in a way that's not physically, well, based, and in a way that's not consistent with how they will respond. So is it possible to, I guess, categorize the phenomena each family of models captures and, you know, kind of like synthesize those like sub-models?
Sorry, didn't fully understand. So the problem is that the sample, the historical sample, is not sufficient to characterize future conditions.
Right.
You're pushing your model too far outside your historical training that it doesn't really know in what direction to go. Yes, you can say we have spatial correlation too. So a place in the United States might be more similar to a place in a subtropical location in India in the future. So we know how a crop may respond to those conditions. But a high emission climate scenario under a +4, +6 degrees Celsius change is unprecedented in many parts of the world. And an empirical model is highlighted by that perfect model experiment, overly pessimistic.
Right. So then what phenomena does can be captured better empirically as opposed to process-based?
Right. So it's not to say that empirical models don't have their place.
Mm-hmm.
And I should point that out very carefully. Empirical models are fantastic tools for near-term prediction, for nowcasting, for highlighting shortcomings of models in historical benchmarking and all sorts of conditions where we have great observational data to benchmark and evaluate the models against. However, if we're pushing things outside of, you know, a sample domain, we have to be very careful about the predictive capacity of those models, and that includes machine learning based models as well. We have done quite some work in a new initiative in AgMIP that we call AgML, training machine learning based, a whole bunch of different types of machine learning based models on historical conditions, replicating the same perfect model experiment. We're providing them with the historical simulations of the process-based crop models and then asking them to reproduce future changes. And they all dramatically fail. And we're trying to resolve that, or trying to constrain or find avenues in which we think it's safe to apply those models. But a high-end climate scenario, end of century, is so far away from our current conditions that all the insights we gained really highlights that these empirical models are not fit for purpose for those type of simulations.
Okay, no, that makes sense. So it's to the extent that training data resembles the target condition, and I mean plants are
Yeah.
not growing very much that we observed in the warmer conditions. So let me ask maybe the last one here. It's to what extent are process-based models calibrated to those conditions? To what extent you need more data?
Yeah, and that's what it comes down to, that the process-based models show a huge amount of uncertainty as well
Right.
and need to be constrained more, which is actually on my next slide.
Cool.
And to respond to that question between empirical versus process-based, I really don't want to get into that camp discussion. One is better than the other. I think that's the wrong conclusion. The conclusion needs to be each model type has its strength and weakness, and we need to use them and apply them in the best way possible. And I actually see the way forward, and that's also on the next slide, that we need to combine machine learning based and process based models in a clever way to move the field forward. And that's basically my last, actually second last slide, but I do want to come to an end to speaking too much here. So we have seen the tremendous uncertainties across these process-based models. If you ask 12 different process-based crop models about maize productivity towards the end of the century, you get that range from plus 10% to minus 70%. For wheat, from plus 60% to minus 40%. What we have established is that the ensemble median usually is a really good indicator for what's actually happening. So yes, we can just average the field and say the median somewhere in the middle is a fairly accurate prediction or projection or outlook. However, that kind of model spread is not acceptable anymore. And what are the steps we can take to address and reduce uncertainty? Here are a couple of projects. This is one aspect of this is CO2 fertilization effect, as mentioned before, substantially inflating the model response. So we need to constrain that too. This is a very haphazard slide. I didn't have time to make it really nice, but I'm flashing a couple of projects that are currently ongoing to work in that direction. And one is surface ozone, which is a toxin and affects plant growth, but it also controls CO2, the CO2 effect on plant growth. So with more and more crop models be able to respond to ozone, I really hope that we can push this field down a little bit. So this is a postdoc of mine who implemented that in my group, and that's available for DSAT, and we're running a multi-model ensemble assessment now to establish that point. Jody Singh, another postdoc in my group, is working on water logging to respond to excess moisture, which is another blind spot explaining some of the model uncertainties. These process-based models are really good to respond to drought and temperature, but not to flood or water logging or anything where too much water is in the system. And it was shown that excess moisture can actually lead to similarly large effects on yield than heat and drought. Model inputs, really, really important. If we don't know what's going on in the field, we can't simulate an accurate system under climate change. So we're constantly improving inputs, including crop calendars, fertilizer application data sets, and so forth. That's an ongoing process and is really something that's not resolved. So lack of quality of management data is a big concern. Finally, breeding. We need to understand better where the breeding community is heading to and what kind of cultivar and genetic material we can expect in the future. We're addressing that aspect in an ongoing project with Corteva AgriScience, where we try to evaluate breeding requirements for the future food systems. And as flashed real quick, I mentioned where I think the field should be heading is to combine process-based modeling capacity and then on top wrap it into an machine learning or AI-assisted hybrid model that can address those remaining blind spots that the process-based model can't address and make them more nuanced, increase fidelity, and make the model really applicable to your local conditions, but it is physics guided or knowledge guided, so it can drift off in directions that are unseen. And finally, I'm closing on this slide, is that we're more and more working towards operational assessment frameworks or integrated assessment frameworks where we bridge across different lead times, leveraging historical trends, and then working on seasonal forecast. Again, something that we can fill a whole seminar with. Now, very hot on the agenda, including decadal predictions, and then folding that into long-term climate change projections based on climate model outputs. Those all together can create a more robust and integrated approach to foresight of agricultural productivity and what that can in turn mean for decision support, insurance sector, farm level investments, and management planning and those kind of things. All right, that was a little bit of a tour de force across a million different aspects that we're working on. I realize I've been speaking for a while. I leave these higher level conclusions here on the slide. I think they're fairly obvious. Yeah, happy to take questions if there are any.
All right, so I actually have a couple of questions in the line. So one is, do crop models take into account specific crops or all crops grown in an area? I think it's probably a question about intercropping and those interactions.
Right. No, process-based crop models simulate specific crops individually. There are sort of ecosystem type models that simulate, forests and grasslands and everything together. They simulate each crop in every grid cell, but you still need to know what crop is planted where and what rotations. Are you planting soybean after maize, or what rice seasons are you planting? So that's one of the management limitations we have, that we don't really know what's happening in the field, especially in places in the global south. In the United States, we have the wealth of very accurate data, but that's not the case everywhere else.
Cool. And then one more, how do bioengineered crops affect models? And I guess, how do you model all these alternative cultivars?
Yeah, that's something we're trying to get more into. We calibrate and specify cultivar and genetic materials in the models. Some models are more complex and can actually do that much better than other crop models. For example, a model like APSIM and DSET allow you to specify a large amount of cultivar traits and genetic characteristics, but then models such as LPJML or CLM crop or Orchidea or more ecosystem type models, and they use a stand in a generic maize plant, and you can't really talk about those nuances in genetic material.
Cool. And then let me see, like one last question. So you were talking about the integration of climate models and crop models, but climate models already have in the community land model, they have a soil crop model in there. To what extent is it constructive to start incorporating them like more tightly with each other?
Right. That's what a lot of people tried, creating Earth system models with a dynamic loop back into the climate model. And that's particularly relevant if you want to study effects from agriculture back into atmospheric pattern, including greenhouse gases or mitigation of greenhouse gases, but also moisture effects. So adding irrigation on a field can actually lead to downstream moisture recycling, where you affect wind pattern and precipitation pattern. Those kind of things rely on a dynamic feedback. However, studying climate impacts and crop productivity alone doesn't really rely on those dynamic couplings, and they just make the system more complicated and complex. many of those huge Earth system models are so cumbersome that they're really difficult to operate. So, and up until now, it's still beneficial to use your crop model in isolation and bundle a bunch of them, use 10 or 15 of those models and sample the range, and apply them in a downstream application. So we use climate inputs, put them into the crop model, rather than spending years and trying to dynamically couple them. But then you only have one model and might be completely off.
Right, that's fair. All right, cool. Well, yeah, thank you very much for your time. It was really insightful. Yeah,
sorry, that's a lot of material. So please reach out. I have it here. Reach out if you have questions or suggestions or want to collaborate. We're an open community, and we always seek, eager folks to work with. Thanks all.
Excellent. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.